I was tired of city life. The noise, the rush, and the never-ending concrete jungle had worn me out. So, when I found a cozy-looking cabin on Airbnb, tucked away in the woods of northern Michigan, it felt like the perfect escape. The pictures showed a charming, rustic place with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a big, comfy bed. It seemed like the ideal spot to unwind for a weekend. I booked it immediately and packed light. Just some clothes, a few books, and my camera. The drive took longer than expected. I had underestimated how remote the location was. My GPS lost signal about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin, and I had to rely on the host's written directions, which I had thankfully printed out. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as it did in the pictures, if not better. It stood alone among tall pines, with a small porch and a rocking chair. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the birds and the wind rustling through the trees. I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Inside, the cabin was quaint and clean. I unloaded my things, set up my camera, and took a few shots of the place. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. I made myself a simple dinner and settled into the rocking chair with a book. As darkness fell, the woods outside the window turned into an inky blackness. I was far from any town, and there were no streetlights to offer comfort. The only light came from the moon and the stars. I decided to turn in early, eager to wake up with the sunrise. The bed was as comfy as it looked, and I drifted off quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The cabin was silent. I thought maybe I had heard an animal outside, but I couldn't be certain. I listened for a few moments, but everything was still. Telling myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and I brewed a cup of coffee, enjoying the morning chill. I spent the day hiking and taking photos, feeling more relaxed than I had in a long time. As the day turned to evening, I made dinner and settled in again with my book. That night, I woke up again, but this time, it was because of a sound. It was a faint, scratching noise coming from outside the cabin. I froze, straining to hear better. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around just outside. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I thought about the host's instructions. There were no neighbors for miles. No one should be out there. I decided to check. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The beam of the flashlight cut through the black, but I saw nothing unusual. Still, the scratching continued. I swallowed my fear and slowly opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch. The noise stopped. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but everything looked normal. Feeling uneasy, I locked the door behind me and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I tried to enjoy my time, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me on edge. I thought about leaving early, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. This time, I didn't bother with the flashlight. I just sat in bed, listening, my mind racing with possibilities. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped, and I finally fell into a restless sleep. Morning came, and with it, a decision. I packed up my things and left the cabin, vowing never to return. As I drove away, I glanced back at the place that had seemed so perfect. In the daylight, it looked as charming as ever, but I knew I'd never forget those nights in the woods. I left a review on Airbnb, mentioning the strange noises but not giving too many details. I didn't want to seem crazy. Later, I received a message from the host. They apologized and mentioned that others had heard the noises too. They said it was probably just animals, but their words didn't reassure me. To this day, I wonder what was out there, scratching at the walls of that little cabin in the woods. Last summer, I booked an Airbnb in a quiet town for a week-long solo retreat. The photos showed a charming, secluded cabin surrounded by trees. It seemed perfect for some peace and quiet away from the city noise. When I arrived, everything looked as expected. The cabin was cozy, with rustic wooden furniture and a small fireplace. There was no cell service, but the host had mentioned that in the listing, and it was fine by me. I was looking forward to disconnecting. The first day was lovely. I spent my time reading on the porch, enjoying the fresh air and the sound of birds. By evening, I felt completely relaxed. As the sun set, I lit a fire in the fireplace, made myself some tea, and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I was woken up by a noise outside. It sounded like someone walking through the woods. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were too heavy and deliberate. I peeked through the window but saw nothing. Telling myself it was just my imagination, I went back to bed. The next night, the same thing happened. This time, the footsteps were closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching the cabin. I checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. Once again, I saw nothing but darkness outside. By the third night, I was getting nervous. The footsteps returned, louder and more frequent. I decided to leave the lights on and stay awake. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound of the doorknob rattling. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. Terrified, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bags and left the cabin before dawn, driving to the nearest town where I could get cell service. I called the Airbnb host and explained what had happened. He seemed genuinely concerned and apologized profusely, promising to check the property himself. A few days later, the host contacted me. He told me that he found signs that someone had been staying in the woods near the cabin. There was a makeshift campsite not far from the property, with food wrappers and empty water bottles scattered around. The host assured me that he had reported it to the local authorities and they would be investigating. Even though I got a full refund, the experience left me shaken. I had gone to the cabin for peace and relaxation, but instead, I felt violated and unsafe. The thought of someone lurking around, watching me, made my skin crawl. Since then, I've been more cautious about booking remote places. I still love the idea of a secluded getaway, but now I always make sure to read reviews carefully and choose locations with better security. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about staying vigilant, even in places that seem perfectly safe. The uneasy feeling stayed with me for weeks. Whenever I tried to sleep, I'd hear phantom footsteps in my mind, remembering the terror of those nights in the cabin. Friends and family tried to comfort me, saying it was probably just a harmless camper, but that didn't erase the fear I felt. I started to research more about safety in remote areas. I learned about personal alarms and invested in one. I also began sharing my travel plans with friends and family, ensuring someone always knew where I was. The experience had changed my approach to travel forever. Months later, I received an update from the host. The authorities had found the person who had been camping near the cabin. It turned out to be a drifter, someone who wandered from place to place, living off the grid. He had a history of trespassing but was otherwise harmless. The host reassured me that the drifter had been moved along and wouldn't return to the area. While it was a relief to know the person wasn't dangerous, it didn't completely erase the fear I felt. The idea of someone unknown being so close without my knowledge was enough to keep me on edge. Over time, the fear faded, but the lesson remained. I now value my safety and peace of mind above all when choosing a place to stay. I always make sure to research, read reviews, and stay in touch with loved ones. The experience, though harrowing, made me a more cautious and aware traveler. That week in the cabin was supposed to be a restful retreat, but it turned into a cautionary tale. I hope my story serves as a reminder to others to prioritize safety and stay vigilant, even in the most serene and picturesque places. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. After working long hours in the city, a quiet cabin in the mountains sounded like heaven. I found a small, cozy Airbnb that seemed perfect, isolated enough for peace, but not too far from civilization. The photos showed a charming wooden cabin surrounded by trees, and the reviews were glowing. I arrived late on Friday evening, just as the sun was setting. The drive up was uneventful, but the last few miles were on a narrow, winding road that made me a bit nervous. I finally reached the cabin, parked my car, and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The silence was complete, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Inside, the cabin was just as the photos had promised, warm and inviting. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a comfortable-looking bed. After unpacking, I decided to explore the surroundings a bit before it got too dark. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods, sticking to a well-worn path. The trees were dense, and it quickly became clear that getting lost here would be easy without the path. After about 15 minutes, I turned back. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I left. My heart began to race, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly. I walked inside, and everything seemed in order. I locked the door, made some tea, and settled down with a book. The first night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I read, cooked, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. In the afternoon, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps. I looked out the window but saw nothing. Telling myself it was probably an animal, I went back to my book. That evening, the sense of unease returned. I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before going to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a soft creaking sound. It was coming from the living room. My heart pounded as I got out of bed and crept to the door. I could see the faint outline of someone standing in the living room. I froze, my mind racing. Should I confront them? Call the police? I took a deep breath and reached for my phone, but it was on the nightstand, a few steps away. The figure moved, and I realized it was heading towards the bedroom. Panic surged through me. I dashed to the nightstand, grabbed my phone, and locked myself in the bathroom, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice was calm, asking for my location and the nature of the emergency. I whispered the details, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The operator assured me that police were on their way and told me to stay on the line. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I heard the creaking of floorboards and the soft thud of footsteps, but I couldn't tell where the intruder was. Finally, I heard the distant sound of sirens. The footsteps stopped, and everything went silent. I held my breath, listening intently. When the police arrived, they found the front door open. They searched the cabin but found no one. The intruder had vanished. They took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things and drove to the nearest motel, my nerves frayed and my mind racing. The next day, I received a call from the Airbnb host, apologizing profusely. They had no idea how someone could have gotten in. They offered a full refund and promised to improve security. I appreciated the gesture, but it didn't erase the fear I felt. I never found out who the intruder was or what they wanted. The police didn't find any fingerprints or clues. It was a weekend meant for relaxation that turned into a nightmare, leaving me with a story I'll never forget and a newfound caution when booking a stay far from home.